Today I'm going to tell you two stories about places you should never go, and these stories unfold in ways you'd never expect. As always, audience appreciation is important. April 1995. Beneath Arizona's scorching sun, a completely different world stretches across the arid lands of the Sonoran Desert, Shadow Cave. This cave is very different from the tourist caves in the region. There is no lighting inside, no railings, no guides, only darkness, twists and turns, and an endless labyrinth. Even the mapped sections are considered dangerous, and almost nothing is known about the uncharted parts. Some who have entered have never seen daylight again. Michael Crawford, 34, stood alone at the entrance to this cave. Michael was much more than an ordinary adventurer. He was an amateur explorer who had spent years exploring nearly all of Arizona's underground systems. He had visited Shadow Cave several times before, venturing a little deeper each time, becoming familiar with the cave's dark corridors. At least, that's what he thought. His goal that day was simple: to explore a side passage he had noticed but never entered. Perhaps he wanted to be the first person to set foot in a section no one had ever seen. This thought holds an irresistible appeal for cavers. However, Michael made critical mistakes that day. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He didn't bring a backup light source. He didn't wear a helmet. He only had an electric miner's lamp and a box of matches with him. He was relying on his sense of direction to find his way back. He had done this before and had always returned without incident. He thought this time would be the same. When he stepped into the cave entrance, the scorching heat outside gave way to cool, damp air. The first section was familiar, wide, walkable, and comforting. But instead of following his usual route, Michael veered off into a side passage. The passage was darker, narrower, and quieter. After crawling and climbing for about an hour, Michael realized a terrible truth. He was lost. When he looked back, the direction he had come from no longer looked familiar. The cave had completely swallowed him up. He tried to turn back, but every tunnel led to a dead end, every turn pulling him deeper. As his panic grew, his heartbeat quickened, and at that very moment, his lamp began to flicker. A few seconds later, the light went out completely. Michael was alone in absolute darkness, hundreds of meters away from daylight. The darkness was so thick that Michael couldn't tell if his eyes were open or closed. At that moment, he remembered the box of matches he had brought with him. With trembling hands, he pulled out the matchbox and struck a match. The tiny flame illuminated the surrounding rocks for a few seconds. This brief flash of light gave him hope. Perhaps he could find the exit. He struck another match, then another. Each time he took a few steps forward, trying to determine his path before the darkness closed in again. But matches burn out quickly. When the last match burned out, Michael found himself in a darkness he had never experienced before. It was absolute darkness. There was no moon, no stars, nothing. When he brought his hand to his face, he could see nothing. His brain was not designed for such a thing. He didn't stop. Couldn't stop. He crawled forward, trying to find his way by rubbing against the walls of the passage, searching for any sign of an exit. He left marks behind him to understand where he had been. The inner sole of his shoe, a torn trash bag, pieces of fabric torn from his clothes. Perhaps if someone came looking for him, they could follow these traces. But no one was looking for him because no one knew where he was. As the hours passed, hunger and thirst began to take hold of his body, but worse was happening in his mind. In the absolute silence, he began to hear his own heartbeat thumping in his chest, a throbbing rhythm in his ears. Then he noticed the sound of his blood circulation, a whispering sound like the blood flowing through his veins. These sounds, which he had never heard before, were driving him mad. He didn't know how much time had passed in the darkness. Minutes, hours, days. His sense of time was beginning to melt away. At one point, he thought he heard the sound of a water drop and was drawn in that direction. But the sound kept receding, and he could never reach it. Then he heard his own name, repeatedly, from far away, like a whisper. He stopped, held his breath, listened, but the only thing he heard was silence. Was it an illusion? Was it real? Or was he going mad? Can you imagine what Michael was going through? Waking up in complete darkness, not knowing where anything is. Now multiply that by days. Now think again about Michael's situation. Perhaps days later, or maybe just hours later, he couldn't tell, he found a crack in front of him. A crack in the rock about 1.2 meters deep, with a slight breeze coming from inside. His exhausted mind interpreted this as a sign of escape. Maybe this passage would lead him to an open area, maybe even to the exit. With the last shred of hope forming inside him, he entered the crack. He lowered himself into the crevice, trying to place his foot on a ledge. But the moment his hips passed the narrowest point, disaster struck. His body was crushed between two sharp rocks. He tried to balance his weight, but the rocks pressed into him from both sides, holding him in place like a vice. He braced his hands against the walls and tried to push up. His body didn't budge. He tried to use his legs, but every movement pulled him further down. He was trapped forever. Panic washed over him like a wave. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness, unable to travel more than a few meters. He was trapped in a place no one could reach. He was buried alive, but his tomb was not earth. It was millions of years of limestone. As the hours passed, or days, it no longer mattered. Michael's mind began to completely cloud over. The darkness was no longer just a visual void. It felt like a living, breathing entity. It seemed to crawl toward him, touch his skin, fill his lungs. The worst part was not knowing whether he was alive or dead. Perhaps he had already died, and this darkness felt like hell, an eternal darkness and loneliness. This thought drove him mad, but even madness offered no escape. He clawed at the rocks with his fingernails, scratching until blood ran from his fingertips. He left deep marks, the final evidence of his hopeless struggle. Michael's wife began to worry when she didn't hear from her husband. The next day, she called the police. Search teams combed through the caves Michael had visited before, but found no trace of him. It took them days just to find his car parked near Shadow Cave. Rescue teams entered the cave, searched the entrance, found his shirt and sunglasses, but didn't notice the obscure side passage Michael had taken. They combed all the mapped sections, no trace. Days later, the search was called off. Michael Ray Crawford was declared missing. December 1996. 20 months after this incident, 3 cavers, Steve Morton, Karen Wells, and Jake Turner, entered Shadow Cave for a mapping project. That day, they chose a route that had not been explored much before. Unbeknownst to them, they were following the same path Michael had taken 20 months earlier. About an hour later, Steve noticed something on the ground. As he got closer, he realized it was a burnt match. A little further on, they found a broken miner's lamp, then some torn pieces of fabric, a shoe sole. The clues stretched like a trail into the depths of the cave. The team, encountering such clues in a previously unexplored passage, abandoned their mapping tasks and began following the trail. Then they saw a dark silhouette on the cave floor. Michael Ray Crawford's body was unrecognizable when found 20 months after his death. His body had partially mummified and partially decomposed in the damp, cool environment of the cave. His facial features were sunken, his eyes hollowed out. His hands were still reaching out toward the rocks. He had fought for survival until his last moment. His fingertips had no nails. They had been worn away by digging into the sharp limestone. The last traces left by his fingers were deep scratches on the rocks. The position of the body told a painful story, a frozen scream of a man who had breathed his last in the darkness, his hips wedged, his arms stretched upward at a distance where rescue was impossible. The team photographed the scene and took the keys they found for identification purposes. They notified sheriff. Days later, a rescue operation began, and Michael's body was finally retrieved from the cave. The wallet in his pocket confirmed his identity. Michael had been lost in the cave, which he had explored many times before for 20 months. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Yes, but it wasn't the search teams who could have prevented it. Michael could have. The cave didn't kill him. His own decisions did. Now I ask you, if you were going into a cave, what would you absolutely take with you? Write it in the comments. Maybe one day you'll save someone's life. Michael Ray Crawford's story ends here, but the channel doesn't. If this story affected you, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next story is much more chilling. March 27, 1982. Beneath the Sparta Mountains in northern New Jersey lies a vast underground labyrinth, Crooked Swamp Cave. This structure, the state's longest cave system, consists of narrow passages, steep drops, and uncharted tunnels. Much of the cave remains unexplored. While some passages are wide enough to walk through comfortably, others require you to crawl on your stomach, so narrow that you can't fully inflate your lungs, taking only half breaths. 48-year-old Sergeant Robert Hadley stood at the entrance to this cave. Hadley was no ordinary man. He was a 22-year veteran of the New Jersey State Police and, outside of his profession, a passionate caver. He was a man who had explored dozens of cave systems in the area, who knew what darkness and narrow passages meant, who felt at home underground. His plan that day was simple: to take an educational trip to Crooked Swamp Cave with 12 Boy Scouts and Assistant Scout Leader Tom Bradley. Among the group were Hadley's own two sons, 12-year-old Daniel and 14-year-old Nathan. For the boys, this would be one of the most exciting days of their lives, exploring the underground world with flashlights. The tour began without incident. The group advanced through the cave's known passages, with Hadley, an experienced guide, explaining the formations to the children. But at one point during the exploration, Hadley's eye caught an uncharted opening, a narrow fissure, about 50 centimeters wide, but passable for an experienced caver. The chance to discover a section that no human had ever seen before was an irresistible pull for someone like Hadley. He made a quick decision and decided to enter this uncharted passage to see where it led. Meanwhile, 14-year-old Nathan excitedly wanted to follow his father. Shortly after Hadley entered the passage, Nathan headed towards it. However, Bradley, the other scout leader, grabbed Nathan by the arm and prevented him from entering. This decision was perhaps the most critical moment of the day, because if Nathan had entered that passage, we would be talking about two names today instead of one. Hadley entered the crevice. The passage sloped slightly downward, requiring him to crawl on his stomach, pushing himself forward with his legs and pulling himself with his arms. The sharp, rough surface of the limestone scraped against his chest and arms like a knife with every forward movement, slowly wearing away the skin beneath his clothes. The passage was so narrow that he couldn't fully inflate his lungs. Each breath was incomplete, his ribcage squeezed by the pressure of the rock above and below, but he couldn't afford to stop. Even though the possibility of being trapped forever lingered in the back of his mind, his experience gave him confidence. After moving a few meters, Hadley's movement suddenly stopped. Ahead of him, a large limestone boulder wedged in a narrow crevice completely blocked the path. The logical thing to do was to turn back, but Hadley must have thought he could dislodge the rock or get around it. He braced his hands against the rock and pushed. The rock moved, but not forward or sideways. It moved upward and settled back into its socket. However, within a very short time, the rock block slid out of its socket and fell directly on top of Hadley, pinning him down. As the limestone block slid, a sharp piece of rock that had come loose struck the right side of Hadley's head. The sharp stone tore the skin on his skull and blood began to flow. Hadley couldn't bring his hand to the wound. His arms were pinned at her sides, her fingers able to move only a few centimeters. He could feel the warm blood trickling down his face into his eyes, but there was nothing he could do. Hadley was completely trapped in a spot that no one could easily reach, and he had a serious bleed that he couldn't dress. Hadley's moans reached the mouth of the passage. Realizing something was wrong, Bradley entered the passage to rescue Hadley. The children desperately began their rescue attempt. They tried pulling on his legs. It didn't work. They tried shifting the rocks around him. It didn't work. In short, they tried everything they could think of. But the geometry of the situation was cruel. Every pull from behind pressed the rock tighter against Hadley's body. Every attempt to help increased the torture. Hadley could feel it. The pressure on his bones, his ribcage squeezing a little tighter, the air entering his lungs decreasing a little more. He was being crushed alive, and the children trying to help were unknowingly accelerating it. After several hours of Bradley and the children trying to rescue him, they finally made the difficult decision to leave Hadley and call for help. It was unclear exactly why they had waited so long, but this delay was melting away Hadley's chances of survival minute by minute. Nathan and Daniel had to leave that cave, leaving their father trapped in the dark and covered in blood. When the rescue teams reached Crooked Swamp Cave, they immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Hadley was 5 meters underground, trapped in a narrow crevice by a rock that was pressing down harder and harder as it was pulled. It was impossible to get him out the way he had entered. There was no way out, at least not through any known passage. The only options were to break the rock or dig around it to create an alternative passage. The team leader was determined to get Hadley out at any cost. Drilling machines and explosives were lowered into the cave. Generators were started, lights were set up. Dozens of rescuers began working in shifts, but each blast carried a new risk. Rocks dislodged by the tremors could fall on Hadley, completely upsetting the already fragile balance. In the first hours of the rescue operation, Hadley was still conscious and able to talk to the teams. He tried to explain how he had become trapped inside the stone prison, how the keystone had shifted. At one point, with the kind of composure expected of a 22-year veteran state trooper, he was still trying to reassure those around him, sealed in darkness in a place no one could reach. But as the hours passed, Hadley's voice grew weaker. The combination of being motionless for hours in a confined space, the relentless blood loss, the cave's bone-chilling cold, and the psychological breakdown caused by all of this had begun to take its toll on his body. The cold was the kind that seeped into the very stone, penetrating to the bone, numbing the muscles, slowly shutting down the body. The blood loss led to dizziness, the dizziness to blurred thinking, and the blurred thinking to a consciousness that was slowly fading away. At 2 a.m. on Sunday morning, about 18 hours after Hadley became trapped, rescue teams heard his last sounds. They were no longer words, just muffled moans, the last signs that he was still alive, still fighting. Then silence, deep, absolute subterranean silence. On Monday morning, Colonel Morrison announced that they had detected no signs of life, but the teams did not stop. Perhaps there was still a chance, perhaps a miracle. For 3.5 days, they dug, drilled, and blasted nonstop. The area had turned into a muddy disaster zone. Heavy equipment had turned the ground into ankle-deep mud. Generators ran day and night. Even in a situation that seemed beyond rescue, no one gave up. Late Tuesday night, the teams finally reached Hadley, but Hadley was already dead. Dr. Graham stated that Hadley had probably died on Sunday. Rescue teams had been fighting for 2.5 days to save a dead man. They gave everything they had to rescue him, but the cave had already made its decision. When they pulled Hadley's body out of the crevice, dried blood was visible on the limestone block his head had been resting against. The trap created by the keystone became fully apparent when the body was removed, a natural vice that tightened as you retreated, loosened as you advanced, but opened into the impenetrable darkness ahead. His had lost his life and the family he left behind for the sake of curiosity.